Gregory Nemet is a professor at the University of Wisconsin's La Follette School of Public Affairs and author of the second edition of How Solar Energy Became Cheap, Pathway to a Solar Centric Economy. So welcome to the interview, Greg.
Thanks, Mark. I'm good to be here.
I interviewed you 2 or 3 years ago when the first edition came out, and this one takes the argument, I think, to its logical conclusion, which is that solar is the way to clean up the supply side of the energy system, and electrification of demand is cleans up and they work together. And for me, that was the core argument of the book. And I'm wondering if you could just kind of give us an overview.
Yeah, I wrote the book originally 8 years ago to understand how solar got cheap so we could create a playbook for other technologies that we'd need. And that's what the book was about. And I've updated it since then. And one of the questions I had was, is it even worth updating? It's a historical view, what's happened since then. As I started looking at what's happened with solar in the 6 or 7 years since the first edition, a lot has changed. And so much has changed that it's really starting to maybe focus more not on what we can learn from solar for other technologies, but also tell the story of what does it mean if solar just keeps going in the direction and at the pace that it has been going. Not talking about speeding up or some breakthrough or some new change, just keep going. Have the driving forces that have been in place for many years now. If they keep going, where do we get to? And that's why I started talking about it as a solar centric economy, because it doesn't take very long until solar is at the core of the energy system rather than on the margins. And that changes some things.
Um, Kingsmill Bond, who's now with Ember Energy, told me 2, 3 years ago, he said, what'll happen is renewables will, first of all, they'll take all the growth. Then they'll cut into the, sort of the core of the electricity or the energy system. And I think we're up to what now for wind and solar? What about 90%, 95%?
Of growth, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that strikes me, because you live in Wisconsin, I live in Canada, and our audiences, North Americans, don't seem to get what's going on in the rest of the world, where solar is just taking global national energy systems by storm, as is the electrification of demand, like EVs and heat pumps.
Yeah. And that's something that's happened very quickly in the 8 years since the first edition of the book, is seeing how solar has grown in many different places. A few points I'd make on that. One, we have places like Australia, and it's particularly South Australia, that are doing large portions of their electricity demand from solar and making that grid reliable and work well, and wanting to do even more solar, because you can do lots of solar when you have complementary technologies like low-cost batteries, which we now have, and invest in grid infrastructure. So that's one thing we see. A second thing is that we see faster growth in solar in the global south than we do in rich countries. So this idea that solar is a luxury good for the rich, but the poor need fossil fuels to develop, that doesn't seem to be what developing countries are deciding to do, is they're growing faster with solar than even rich countries are. So that's a big change. And I guess the third thing to think about is more than 90% of the solar industry is outside of North America. And I think as we live in North America and to digest the discourse on energy and the choices we have available, it is important to understand what's happening in the rest of the world, and that the decisions that do happen in North America, some of them affect the rest of the world, but a lot of them don't. In a lot of cases, especially with solar, other parts of the world are just charging ahead because it's such an opportunity to have reliable, low-cost, clean electricity.
Is that why you say that India is the key market going forward?
India is important because it's so big and it hasn't fully developed yet. So whether India grows in the way that China has grown, or whether it picks its own path that looks more like the way China is growing now and focuses on taking advantage of electrification and low-cost energy like solar and doing domestic manufacturing and leaving a lot of its fossil fuels, especially coal, in the ground, that's a choice that India has available. They are investing in solar. They are investing in manufacturing of solar, despite the tremendous advantages that China has had by developing its industry over the last 20 years. So India is only 3% of global manufacturing of solar, but it wants to scale up quickly. And even if all it does is just meet its own demand for solar energy, that's substantial because then India can see solar as something that can make it self-sufficient, not just in producing electricity, but in acquiring the equipment to produce electricity. And that's a real opportunity for India. So yeah, I would look at India as an important country here.
Now, you mentioned the Global South earlier, and that's important to me because we've done many videos here at Energy Media about the oil demand modeling. And the a couple of key ones are the International Energy Agency, which is kind of a middle ground but optimistic. And then there's OPEC, which basically says that clean energy technologies like solar and EVs are really expensive. They only work if they're subsidized, and it expects the global South to stick with oil and gas. And then it goes on to model, oil demand growing out to 2050. And it's widely quoted in the oil industry, like it's like the Bible. And it's wrong. And the last year or two, and China in particular, its move into the global South has demonstrated just how wrong it is. I'll just throw that out back to you for comment.
Yeah, no, it's a good way to put it. I mean, I think what makes that assumption about fossil fuels forever and oil forever wrong is that the alternatives have emerged and they work, they're affordable, and increasingly they're really appealing. Like an EV built in China with full, electrification of navigation and information and entertainment and eventually automation of self-driving, like that's all happening very quickly. That seems super appealing. You don't need gasoline to fuel that car. You've got electricity coming from solar renewables and other sources. And so that just feels like a much more appealing choice to make than to build an infrastructure based on fossil fuels because everybody knows at this point what happens when you become dependent on fossil fuels. And there are actually very few countries in the global south that produce their own oil and enough for domestic consumption. So they become importers, they become dependent, they become vulnerable to oil price shocks that happen regularly. And we know because it's such an interconnected industry that a conflict in the Middle East or in Ukraine or somewhere else has impacts on prices everywhere in the world that uses oil. So if you can find a way to fuel your economic development and not depend on oil, you can plan for the future and you have a much brighter future and a more stable one.
We're going to finish up this overview of your book with this question, and that is uh, solar at utility scale versus distributed solar on rooftops, community solar, that sort of thing. So far, most of the growth, or a lot of the growth, has been at grid scale. Do you expect that as we go forward, it'll be the distributed use of solar that will dominate?
Well, it's come back, the distributed part of solar. So originally, the small scale solar was what got solar going, and it was only when solar got cheap enough to really compete with centralized fossil fuels in the 2010s that we had utility scale solar. And utility scale solar is cheaper because you spread fixed costs around across many more megawatt hours of electricity. So we have seen huge growth in utility scale solar. But what I've noticed in updating the book for the last 5 or 6 years of data is that the percent that's distributed solar, small scale rooftop solar, has been rising over the last 5 years. And I think it's because we've got new types of consumers that are getting into the act. They're especially in developing countries doing small scale electrification. And we've seen it in Pakistan in the last couple of years, and we're seeing it in other places as well. So there is something about this modularity of solar, this small scale combined with the low cost that lets people do lots of different things with solar, and they don't need to be centrally planned. They don't need to be massive investments. They can be playing around the edges, but that has led to a lot of adoption of solar. And now we see more growth in rooftop solar than we have in centralized solar. So that's an interesting development in the last 5 years.
Okay, that'll be the end of the overview interview. And for each one of these separate interviews, I'll do a little, 60-second intro myself to say,
Okay.
Greg, yada, yada, yada. Here's what he's going to be talking about. Well, let's talk about global innovation and not national triumphs, because we these days we associate solar with China. But as you point out in your book, it actually got started in the US and then Germany popularized it before China took over and mass manufactured it. Maybe you could just explain how that worked.
Yeah, I mean, it starts in science in the 1800s, and then the US commercialized it with Bell Laboratory and using it for the response to Sputnik and the satellite program. And then in the oil crisis in the 1970s, the US really investing in solar research and development, and even a really initial small scale market for solar. That all ended in 1981 when Ronald Reagan came into the office and shut down the US solar program. It looks a lot like what the Trump administration is doing in 2025. And I see some of the similarities in which the frontier of innovation just went elsewhere. It went to Japan, it went to Germany. Japan took the reins in the 1980s. Germany took the reins in building a market in 2000s with its subsidy law, and then China started selling to Germany, and then eventually really started scaling up and massively investing in production of solar. And one interview I did really clarified it to me about how China took the lead from Germany. Germany seemed to have all the advantages. It had a domestic market, it was wealthy, it was willing to subsidize, but China won. And what one German respondee from the solar industry said was that when Germany was thinking in megawatts, the Chinese were thinking in gigawatts. They were much more ambitious. They really saw a big future for solar. There was less caution. There was less concern about overcapacity. That has got to be a defining characteristic of China's rise in general. This ability to grow and this willingness to tolerate too much capacity and just meet use that capacity up within a couple of years of growth, and then China's just been on its way, and so now we've got 85% of solar manufacturing happening in China, and that's a lot of concentration. And we've got some happening in Southeast Asia and Vietnam and Malaysia, and a little bit now in India, and small amounts in the US and some other places as well. But it's still really dominated by China.
One of the things that strikes me about this is the role that government has played. I mean, it came out of, in the you were talking about Sputnik and the Apollo program and all of that, space being exploration being powered by solar. Um, but then the government dropped it, and then Germany picks it up, and then China comes along, and China has a very strategic industrial policy. And that seems to have made all the difference.
Yeah, industrial policy has been part of solar's rise all along the way. What the US did in the 70s, the Japanese in the 80s, the Germans in 2000s, and the Chinese after 2010. The only other aspect I would look into is the early Chinese period from 2000 until the global financial crisis in 2008 or 9. That was not central government. That was the Wild West. That was entrepreneurs, Chinese students that had trained in Australia, worked with solar there, going back to China and saying maybe now is the time to do production here, scavenging around the world for used PV production equipment, struggling to raise single digit millions of dollars to start a line, and finding very little support until they were able to convince Germans that they could sell panels to them, and until they were able to convince pension funds in the US that Chinese solar was a good investment. And so you had this flow of money from teachers' retirement funds in the US going to China for solar companies. The Chinese were using that money to buy equipment from Austria, from Switzerland, from Italy, from the US, bring it back to China, produce solar with that equipment, sell it to Germany, and then to other places like California and Spain after that. And it's really this global innovation system and these flows of knowledge and money moving around the world. But that was not coordinated by the Chinese central government. It was only in the global financial crisis, 2008 or 9, that those companies became at risk, those Chinese companies, because governments around the world were cutting their subsidies, especially in Spain. And so the government stepped in to support Chinese production and eventually created a domestic market. And so since 2010, clearly there's been industrial policy, but before that, it was an entrepreneurial landscape, and there's still part of that today.
That's actually quite fascinating. Um, so the other part of the solar industry, Oh, I know what I wanted ask you about, and that is the percentage of manufacturing capacity in the Chinese solar industry that's actually being used. Because I was reading some in a Bloomberg story that only 38% of that capacity is utilized, and that gets to your comment earlier about how eventually the Chinese will use 100% of it, and at that point they'll be flooding, I guess, global markets with panels.
Yeah. And I think the other thing to think about with that is that with that overcapacity, if that situation were happening in Canada or in the US, those companies would probably go bankrupt because they're not utilizing their capital fully and they'd be penalized by investors and maybe shut down. But in China, that's not the case because growth is so strong that you can imagine that 38% capacity gets used up within a couple of years. And so there's just a little bit more patience, but not a lot. It's just a couple of years. And then you're back up to reasonable amounts of 70, 80% of utilization of the capacity. So being a little bit ahead has not been a problem for China, but it seems like that is a bit of a problem when that's happened in Western economies, and that has been a big difference.
You also make the point in the book that the other part of the solar equation is the soft costs, installation and permitting and so on. Maybe you could address that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big part as the cost of the devices, the photovoltaic cells have come further and further down. The portion of the installed costs that is cells is also come down. And so the portion that's humans, roofers, electricians installing systems on roofs or doing them in a large centralized location, it's become a bigger share of the cost. And we have seen some improvements in learning by doing in terms of how solar gets installed and doing it more efficiently. But that becomes more of the cost as the cost of the hardware has come down. And so one thing I've been doing is looking into the places with the lowest installation costs. And those are not the places that you might guess. I mean, maybe you might guess India because you have low labor costs there. But just with India are Germany and Australia that have the lowest install cost in the world. And there it's not an issue of low cost labor. It's an issue of people knowing what they're doing a lot of it, learning by doing, and having strong incentives to install quickly. And there was this program in Australia where people were getting installs in one day. And I watched the systems getting installed in my neighborhood or from my relatives, and it's not a day, it's weeks to get a system connected, and that's a big difference. So we can learn from what's doing well, and what Australia's been doing with residential installations is really a model for the rest of the world to see how they've done it and see how they've been able to do it affordably. So it's a real cost, the soft cost, but they can be reduced, and we have examples of that.
I'm wondering what you think about trends like we're seeing in Germany with balcony solar. These panels are so light and so cheap. You hang them off your balcony, you plug them into your just into your wall plug, and you've got electricity. Is that just a novelty, or is this idea of really simple, easy to use, consumers can do it, there's no installation costs, and is that maybe going to catch on?
It's a good question. I don't think it's a novelty. I think it is something that's really deeply part of how solar works because it is modular. It functions really well with the existing system. If you have a small system, like these balcony solar systems are limited to about 4 panels so that your electrical wiring can handle just plugging them straight in to the outlets that you have there. And that's starting to happen in the US as well. But there's this contagion effect that we have where we've seen what in my book, I was tracking about 1 million systems that have been installed in the last 2 years in solar in Germany for balcony solar. But that number is like 3 or 4 million now. It just continues to keep going. But because I think it's representative of what's likely to happen in the rest of the world. Not that every balcony will have solar on it, but I think a lot will. But just think of the other ways that you could do small scale solar and not have to get approval, not have to get permission to do it. That's part of what makes it so expensive in a North American context to install solar. It's all the planning and permitting. And if you do it small, like balcony systems, you're not going to disrupt the electrical grid. And you also don't need to wait for permission to do it. So that really, I think is there's going to be more and more pressure to do those types of systems in a North American context because for a variety of reasons, electricity is going to get more scarce in North America, and so having that system available would be more attractive.
My final question actually is segues from your last answer, and that is we're seeing the grid in the U.S. in particular under serious stress, and more stress coming in the form of demand from artificial intelligence data centers. And what we're seeing in response by some on the part of homeowners, but also on the part of industry and large commercial operations, which are now self-generating. And so they get solar panels, they get a battery, they get digital controls, and maybe they're part of a microgrid in their industrial park, something like that. And it seems like solar kind of lends itself to that. I need a solution. How can I integrate all of these pieces together around solar for my business? Or maybe it's my home.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Absolutely. I think that's likely to happen because it's so reasonable to do it. The solar is now very affordable. The batteries are now very affordable. And as you importantly pointed out, the electrical controls that make it work together and make it work with the loads that you have in your business or community also have gotten sophisticated and can handle the changes that happen when there's clouds and night and things that solar gets affected by. So I see that happening more and more. I think the pressures that come with higher prices due to increased demand for electricity, such as with data centers, but also with electric vehicles and heat pumps and other electrification, I think will lead to more demand for self-generation. And the tools are way, way better now than they were in the past. And so I think you'll see quite a bit of that. And maybe data centers lead with it because they need a lot of electricity, but what they really need is a lot of electricity very quickly. And planning for even a natural gas combined cycle power plant or a nuclear power plant to fuel that, it sounds appealing. It sounds like you can have the electricity all the time, but we're talking 2030s for those types of plants. Whereas with solar and batteries, you could do that much more quickly. And I think that'll be attractive to them as well as other businesses.
Okay. That's the second interview. Now we're going to go into demand electrification.
Okay.
And this is this is close to my heart. So
Okay, great.
Greg, one of the things that has really struck me over the last year, maybe two, is the extent to which we're talking now about electrifying demand. So, solar, we think about on the supply side, generating the electricity. We haven't spent nearly as much time in North America, certainly, talking about how that electricity gets used and how the devices that harness that energy, like our vehicles and our how we heat and cool our house, are being electrified and the costs are coming down. And I would argue that there, in fact, the electric option now is almost always the best option.
Yeah, I mean, big change in electrification of demand in some key sources that in the past we wouldn't have thought of as being amenable to electrification. So heating is one where, for the most part, we're talking about direct combustion of fossil fuels for household heating with some electrical resistance heating. I grew up in Quebec and we had lots of that happening. But now we have new technologies that are way more efficient than that, where we've got heat pumps that where you take electricity in a much more efficient way and use that for heat. You can use that same device for cooling, which in a changing climate, there'll be more and more demand for electrified cooling. And then for vehicles, which until 10 years ago was not something we thought of as an electrical option, but now it is because of low cost battery technology. And that those changes are meaning that having access to electricity is much more interesting, and having a grid that's highly functioning and has information flowing with it is very appealing. So electrification of demand is a big change and is moving quite quickly.
3 years ago, 4 years ago, I was interviewing folks who were working in the renewable energy space. And they were estimating that as much as 30% of global primary energy by 2050 would have to be hydrogen because there just were too many use cases where it was hard to abate emissions and the electric options weren't viable. So
Yeah.
steel making would be one, long haul transportation would be another. All that's changed. all and in this in such a short period of time. Now, the hydrogen use cases are very much smaller, and the electric options are much more economic. Were you surprised at how quickly that turned?
Yeah, I think I am surprised about that. And it's been an encouraging surprise because I work with people that do these kind of global climate models. And one of the things we talk about are hard to abate sectors, places where we do everything we can to clean up electricity supply and demand, but there's parts that just don't won't change because they're just inherently going to be fossil fuel consuming, and those just keep shrinking because the use cases for batteries, for heat pumps, for heat coming from electricity in whatever way, just keep emerging and getting better. And so I think that has really been a faster change than I would have expected, and it's really being driven by the availability of electricity and some of the low cost options like renewables, as well as some of the technological changes, such as heat pumps and batteries that just enable lots of different use cases. And then people getting creative about what you do with a heat pump and how hot you can get a heat pump and what kind of industrial processes you can replace that used to use fossil fuels directly.
Yeah, that's what really intrigues me is we've seen the emergence of an innovation ecosystem in China that's just enormous. And there's lots of folks arguing that China now leads technical innovation as leapfrog the US. But even in the US, lots and lots of entrepreneurs who are coming out of university labs, taking technology off the bench and then getting it commercialized. And I'm thinking of things like the Rondo heat battery, that sort of thing. And the pace of innovation and the amount of resources that are being thrown into R&D and innovation, I think argues for supports your argument that electrification is going to do nothing but increase in the future.
Yeah, and I think what you're seeing with this pace of innovation is some momentum that comes from just people being convinced this is energy problem is an important one to work on, that they can start up a company on it, that they can raise money on it, that they can spend their careers working on this, and that doesn't go away with an election. And it maybe gets slowed down because the subsidies for demonstration programs for industrial processes, low carbon industrial processes, go away, and some of those the money gets clawed back, and that's happening, and that'll slow things down. But there's an underlying momentum that has to do with the choices that are available, with the direction of travel that's also guided by the rest of the world. I mean, these companies that are operating or raising money, usually they're not just in Canada or just in the US. They're connected to the rest of the world, either because suppliers come from there or they're selling to the rest of the world. And policies are different in those places. And also sometimes energy is more scarce in those places. And being able to do something more efficiently is valuable. So there is a momentum now and a pace of innovation that I agree with you is really impressive and encouraging, and that I think gets us through a period where there's less emphasis on government support of clean innovation because there's still incentives to do it.